Old widow was mocked for having no husband. Mountain man knelt and said, "You have one now." A cold wind blows through the dusty street as church bells echo down the valley. An old widow walks into town, alone, head bowed, while cruel laughter follows her every step. They mock her for having no husband, no name left worth speaking. But then the saloon doors swing open, and a mountain man steps from the shadows. He drops to one knee before her, voice steady as stone. "Ma'am, you have one now." The town falls silent. What began as a moment of mercy turns into the scandal of the year. Whispers spread, alliances shift, and buried deeds, debts, and secrets rise like ghosts. This stranger didn't kneel for show. He knelt to settle a promise long unpaid. Now, with land, law, and pride on the line, one woman's faith and one man's guilt will be tested before God and the whole town. Will their act of kindness spark redemption or destroy everything they hold sacred? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The gray clouds hung low over Cold River's main street that spring morning, matching Martha Lyle's heavy heart as she made her way down from her hillside cabin. The worn path beneath her feet had known her steps for decades, ever since she and her late husband had first settled here. Now, like the weather-beaten fence posts along the trail, she stood alone. Martha pulled her faded shawl tighter around her shoulders, her silver hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet. The list of supplies she needed was short: flour, coffee, and salt. Simple things that shouldn't require courage to purchase, and yet her heart quickened as she approached Miller's general store. The bell above the door announced her arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed at odds with the atmosphere inside. Luna Vane's voice carried across the store like a sharp wind, though she pretended to whisper to her circle of friends near the fabric counter. "Look who's here, buying provisions like she's still keeping house for two." The words sliced through the air, meant to wound. Martha kept her chin up, moving toward the counter where Mr. Miller stood arranging penny candy in glass jars. She could feel Luna's eyes on her back, could hear the poorly concealed snickers from the group of women. "Poor thing," Luna continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Living up there all alone, probably talking to herself all day long. Must be going daft, don't you think, ladies?" The other women tittered, their laughter echoing off the tin ceiling. Martha's hands trembled as she reached for her coin purse, the familiar leather suddenly slipping through her fingers. It fell to the plank floor with a soft thud, coins spilling out and rolling in every direction. The laughter grew louder. Martha's cheeks burned as she bent to gather the scattered coins, her fingers clumsy with embarrassment. She wanted nothing more than to flee, to retreat to her cabin, and never return to town. But she needed these supplies. Her pantry was nearly bare. The store's bell chimed again, and heavy boots thudded on the wooden floor. A hush fell over the room as Hudson Boone stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of pine needles and mountain snow. His weather-beaten face was partially hidden behind a graying beard, but his eyes were sharp and clear as they took in the scene before him. Martha knew of Hudson Boone. Everyone in Cold River did. The mountain man kept to himself mostly, coming to town only when necessary for supplies or to sell his furs. Some said he'd once been a ranch foreman. Others whispered about his past as a trail guide. But all agreed that something had changed him years ago, driving him to seek solitude in the high country. Hudson's gaze moved from Martha kneeling on the floor to Luna's group, then back again. Without a word, he crossed the store in long strides. Martha's breath caught as his broad figure stopped before her, and then, to everyone's astonishment, Hudson Boone knelt down. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the silent store. "You have one now." The words hung in the air like morning mist. Martha stared at him, her heart drumming an uneven rhythm against her ribs. This man, this mountain-hardened soul, was kneeling before her in front of the entire town, offering— what exactly? Protection? Companionship? The gesture itself spoke volumes, harking back to the old ways of frontier chivalry that many thought long dead. Hudson gathered the remaining coins with careful movements, his calloused hands gentle as he returned them to her purse. Standing again, he turned to Mr. Miller. "The lady's goods," he said, pulling out his own money pouch. "I'll settle her bill." Luna Vane's face had turned the color of sour milk, her mouth hanging open in a most unladylike fashion. Her friends shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding great interest in examining the fabric bolts before them. Martha found her voice at last, though it came out barely above a whisper. "Mr. Boone, I can't accept—" "Already done," he replied simply, placing the coins on the counter. Without another word or glance at anyone, Hudson turned and walked out of the store, the bell marking his exit as it had his entrance. Martha stood rooted to the spot, her coin purse clutched tightly in her hands. Mr. Miller busied himself gathering her supplies, wrapping them carefully in brown paper. The store had erupted in whispers as soon as the door closed behind Hudson, and Martha could feel dozens of eyes upon her. "Here you are, Mrs. Lyle," Mr. Miller said kindly, pushing the package across the counter. "Would you like some help carrying these?" "No, thank you," Martha managed, gathering her dignity around her like a cloak. "I can manage." She walked out of the store with her head high, though her knees felt weak as spring shoots. Already she could hear the news spreading up and down the street. Hudson Boone, the hermit of the high country, kneeling before Martha Lyle like a knight of old. What did it mean? What would come of it? The weight of the paper-wrapped package in her arms felt like nothing compared to the weight of meaning in Hudson's simple gesture. As Martha made her way back up the hill to her cabin, she could hear hoofbeats on the packed earth of the main street, riders no doubt spreading the morning's events to every corner of Cold River. Behind her, Luna Vane burst from the store, her face twisted with frustrated anger. The proud woman had wielded her words like weapons for so long, cutting down those she deemed beneath her. Now, with one quiet act of dignity, Hudson Boone had turned her cruelty back on itself. Martha's steps slowed as she reached her cabin's front gate. The old house stood against the sky, unchanged from an hour ago when she'd left it. Yet something had shifted in the world, like the first warm breeze of spring after a long winter, promising change and new beginnings. She turned to look back at the town below, where people moved through the streets like busy ants, carrying the morning's story with them. Her hands still trembled slightly as she opened her gate, but this time not from shame or fear. For the first time in years, Martha Lyle felt something different stirring in her heart, something that felt remarkably like hope. The spring evening settled over Cold River like a gossamer veil, but the town buzzed with talk that traveled faster than any telegraph message could spark across the wires. Martha sat in her rocking chair by the window, watching shadows lengthen across her small garden while distant voices drifted up from the town below. "Mrs. Boone!" She heard a passing rider call out in greeting, though she'd quickly ducked away from the window. The name clung to the air like morning dew, refusing to evaporate even as the sun sank behind the mountains. Throughout the afternoon, Martha had watched riders crisscross the dusty streets below, spreading news of Hudson Boone's extraordinary gesture in Miller's general store. Each telling seemed to grow more elaborate than the last. By supper time, she'd heard at least 3 different versions floating up from the road that passed her cabin. The lamp flame flickered as Martha moved about her small home, its familiar walls suddenly feeling like a stranger's house. She couldn't settle, couldn't find peace in her usual evening routines. Her hands shook as she tried to mend a torn apron, making stitches so uneven she had to pull them all out and start again. Finally, she gave up any pretense of normal activity. In her bedroom, the silver frame on her bedside table caught the lamplight. Martha picked it up, her fingers tracing the familiar edges as she stared at her late husband's photograph. Thomas's kind eyes gazed back at her, his expression frozen in time from 15 years ago. "What would you make of all this, Thomas?" she whispered to the still image. Her heart felt pulled in opposite directions, grateful for Hudson's kindness in defending her, yet mortified by the town's reaction. The whispers and knowing looks made her feel like a character in someone else's story. Sleep proved elusive that night. Martha lay in her bed, watching moonlight trace patterns on her quilted coverlet while her mind whirled with memories of the day. Hudson Boone's quiet dignity as he knelt before her, Luna Vane's shocked expression, the weight of dozens of eyes following her every move afterward. Dawn arrived with little relief, painting the eastern sky in gentle pinks and golds. Martha had just finished feeding her chickens when she heard heavy boots on the path to her door. Her heart jumped as she recognized Hudson Boone's broad-shouldered figure approaching. He stopped a respectful distance from her porch, removing his hat. The morning light caught the silver in his beard and the weather-worn creases around his eyes. "Mrs. Lyle," he said, his voice as rough and honest as mountain granite. "I've come to apologize." Martha's hands twisted in her apron. "Apologize? But you showed me nothing but kindness, Mr. Boone. Reckon I might have caused you more trouble than help." He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with lengthy conversation. "Didn't mean to set tongues wagging. Just couldn't abide seeing cruelty done to a good woman." His plain words, spoken without flourish or pretense, touched Martha's heart more deeply than any flowery speech could have. Here was a man who understood the weight of words, who used them sparingly and meant each one. "I brought these," he continued, holding out a small bundle of pelts, beaver and marten, prime winter catches. "To repay any trouble I've caused, and the supplies from yesterday." "Mr. Boone, I couldn't possibly—" "Please." The single word carried such quiet dignity that Martha found herself reaching for the bundle before she could think better of it. Just as Hudson turned to leave, hoofbeats approached up the path. Reverend Josiah Dobbs appeared on his dappled mare, his clerical collar bright white against his travel-worn coat. The circuit preacher's eyebrows rose slightly at finding Hudson Boone at Martha's door, but his voice remained even as he dismounted. "Mrs. Lyle, Mr. Boone, good morning to you both." He pulled a leather document case from his saddlebag. "I've just returned from Laramie with some matters that require attention. Mr. Boone, it's providential I've found you here." Martha noticed Hudson stiffen slightly, his stance shifting as if preparing for unwelcome news. The Reverend pulled out several papers, holding them carefully in the morning breeze. "These property records arrived from the territorial office," Reverend Dobbs explained, his wise eyes moving between Martha and Hudson. "It seems, Mr. Boone, that you're listed as co-owner of the old Vane Ranch property." Martha's heart pounded against her ribs. The Vane Ranch bordered her small plot on two sides, land that had stood empty since Luna's father lost it to gambling debts years ago. "There's more," the Reverend continued. "The survey lines may affect the boundary of Mrs. Lyle's property. The original markers were never properly recorded when the Vanes first sectioned off this part of the hillside." Hudson's face had gone still as stone. "I bought those shares fair and square, preacher. Years back, before—" He stopped abruptly, something dark flickering behind his eyes. "No one's questioning the legitimacy of your claim, Mr. Boone," Reverend Dobbs assured him. "But given the possible overlap with Mrs. Lyle's property, I thought it best to bring this to both your attention directly. before others start drawing their own conclusions. Too late for that, Martha thought. Already she could see riders slowing on the road below, watching the scene on her porch with undisguised interest. By noon, every soul in Cold River would be speculating about why Hudson Boone and Reverend Dobbs had paid an early morning call to the widow's cabin. "Some folks are already suggesting you two might be partners in more ways than one," the Reverend added gently, confirming Martha's fears. "I thought you should both be aware of how things appear." Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks. First the mockery in the store, then the town's reaction to Hudson's gesture, and now this property matter. It seemed the Lord was determined to test her dignity at every turn. Hudson's voice cut through her thoughts, solid as an oak beam. "The widow's claim stands. I won't have her land disputed. Nevertheless, we'll need to review the documents properly," Reverend Dobbs said. "Perhaps we could meet tomorrow to discuss the details?" His tone made it more of a statement than a question. "Much obliged for bringing this to our attention, Reverend," Martha managed to say, though her voice wavered slightly. The word "our" felt strange on her tongue, linking her situation with Hudson's in yet another unexpected way. Hudson settled his hat back on his head, nodding to them both. "I'll come by your office tomorrow, preacher." With that, he strode away, his long steps carrying him quickly down the path. Martha watched him go, the bundle of pelts still in her arms. The morning sun had risen fully now, promising another day of watching her life become fodder for Cold River's endless appetite for gossip. "Don't fret too much, Martha," Reverend Dobbs said kindly, mounting his horse. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, but he never gives us more than we can bear with his help." As the Reverend rode away, Martha stood on her porch, feeling the weight of change settling around her shoulders like a heavy shawl. The small bundle of pelts in her arms carried the scent of pine and snow. Hudson's world. Now, through an unexpected twist of fate and property lines, their lives had become entangled in ways neither of them could have predicted. Below in Cold River, she could already see people gathering in small clusters, heads bent together in conversation. The story would grow with each telling: the widow, the mountain man, and now shared property lines. Martha took a deep breath and went inside, closing her door on the whispers that seemed to rise like morning mist from the valley below. 2 days passed like molasses in winter, each hour thick with speculation from the townsfolk. On the morning of the third day, Martha watched Hudson Boone's horse kick up dust on the trail leading to town. Her hands smoothed her gray dress as she stepped onto her porch, knowing she needed to follow. Whatever secrets lay in those property records affected her future, too. The clerk's office occupied a corner of Cold River's courthouse, a squat building that smelled of leather bindings and lamp oil. Martha's boots echoed on the wooden floor as she entered, finding Hudson already bent over a stack of yellowed papers. Reverend Dobbs stood nearby, his presence lending authority to their search. "Mrs. Lyle," Hudson acknowledged her with a slight nod, his voice carrying the same quiet strength she remembered. "Reckon you should see this too." Martha moved closer, careful to maintain a proper distance. The clerk, Mr. Peterson, pushed his wire-rimmed spectacles up his nose and pulled another leather folder from a shelf. "Found something interesting in the 1872 records," he said, spreading out a folded document that crackled with age. Martha's heart nearly stopped when she saw the familiar signature at the bottom. Thomas Lyle, her late husband's careful penmanship still clear after all these years. Beside it was the sprawling signature of Gerald Vane, Luna's father, and a third name she didn't recognize. "Your husband," Reverend Dobbs explained gently, apparently co-signed a debt for the Vane ranch. It seems he helped keep Gerald Vane from jail over some gambling troubles. Martha's fingers traced Thomas's signature. "He never told me," she whispered. "He was always helping folks, but this—" "There's more," Mr. Peterson said, adjusting his spectacles again. The surviving clause lists both Hudson Boone and Thomas Lyle as security holders. When Mr. Boone bought his share years back, it seems the original debt arrangement was never properly dissolved. Hudson's weather-worn face remained impassive, but Martha noticed his hands tighten slightly on the edge of the desk. Meaning? Meaning, Reverend Dobbs interjected, that Mrs. Lyle may legally share claim with you now as heir to her husband's interests. The room fell silent except for the tick of the wall clock. Martha felt dizzy with the implications. Thomas had never mentioned this arrangement, perhaps trying to spare her worry. Now his last act of kindness had somehow bound her future to Hudson Boone's. A commotion in the hallway broke the heavy silence. Luna Vane burst through the door, her face flushed with anger. "So it's true," she spat. "You're all here plotting to steal my family's land." "Miss Vane," Reverend Dobbs started, but Luna cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Don't Miss Vane me, Reverend. I've watched that widow up there, pretending to be so proper and peaceful. Meanwhile, she's been scheming with this mountain man to take what's rightfully mine." Martha felt her cheeks burn. "Luna, I knew nothing about this until—" "Oh, save your innocent act!" Luna's voice rose shrilly. "First you let him make a spectacle in the store, and now this? The two of you probably planned it all along." Hudson stepped forward, his bulk filling the doorway. "That's enough," he said quietly, but with steel in his voice. "Mrs. Lyle's done nothing wrong. These papers are legal and true." "Legal?" Luna laughed bitterly. "My father was drunk when he signed those papers. Everyone knows Thomas Lyle took advantage." "You watch your tongue about Thomas Lyle." Martha surprised herself by speaking up, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "He tried to help your father keep this land. If anyone's to blame for losing it, it's Gerald Vane himself." Luna's face went white with fury. She opened her mouth to reply, but Reverend Dobbs stepped between them. "Ladies, this is neither the time nor place. These matters need careful consideration and prayer, not heated words." "Prayer won't get my ranch back," Luna snapped, but she backed away from the Reverend's calm authority. Her eyes found Martha's again. "This isn't over, Mrs. Lyle. Not by a long shot." She turned and stormed out, leaving behind the sharp scent of her perfume and the echo of her boot heels. Martha sagged slightly, grateful for the solid desk beside her. Hudson watched her with concern in his dark eyes. "Perhaps you should sit down, ma'am." No, I'm fine." Martha straightened her spine. "Mr. Peterson, might we have copies of these documents?" The clerk nodded, already reaching for his pen and fresh paper. "I'll have them ready by sunset." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of legal terms and careful explanations. When they finally stepped outside, the sun was sinking behind the mountains, painting the sky in deep purples and golds. Martha pulled her shawl closer against the evening chill. "Mr. Boone," she said before he could mount his horse, Would you join me for supper? I've got a pot of stew simmering, and after all this—" She gestured vaguely at the courthouse behind them. Hudson studied her face for a long moment. "That's right kindly of you, ma'am. I accept." The walk back to her cabin was quiet, broken only by the sound of Hudson's horse's hooves and the evening call of meadowlarks. Martha's mind whirled with the day's revelations, but somehow Hudson's solid presence beside her made it all seem less overwhelming. Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight. Martha busied herself with bowls and spoons, while Hudson removed his hat and coat, looking almost too large for her small sitting room. The stew's rich aroma filled the air, and Martha silently thanked the Lord she'd thought to put it on before leaving that morning. They ate without much talk at first, the simple food warming them after the long day. Through her window, Martha noticed the first snow flurries of the evening drifting past, delicate and fleeting in the lamplight. Been alone too long? Hudson said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. His voice was soft, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Forgot how it feels to share a proper meal. Martha looked up from her bowl, surprised by his openness. How long? Since Sarah passed. 15 years now. He set his spoon down carefully. Took to the mountains after. Seemed easier than facing folks. I understand that, Martha said quietly. After Thomas, well, sometimes being alone feels safer than risking more loss. Hudson nodded, his eyes meeting hers across the table. But maybe that ain't what the Lord intends for us. The snow fell more steadily now, adding a hushed quality to the evening. Martha felt something shift in her heart, like ice breaking up on a spring river. Maybe not, she agreed softly. In the gentle lamplight, with snow dancing beyond her windows, and Hudson's quiet presence across her table, Martha sensed that change had already taken root in her life. It frightened her, yes, but it also carried a whisper of hope she hadn't felt in years. The morning sun painted Cold River's hills in golden light as Martha guided her mare alongside Hudson's weathered stallion. They followed the old ranch road, winding through patches of melting snow and early spring grass. Her heart quickened as they crested the final rise, revealing the Vane Ranch spread out below them. Oh my, Martha breathed, pulling her horse to a stop. The ranch house, once the grandest in the valley, stood like a blackened skeleton against the morning sky. Scorched beams reached upward like pleading fingers, and broken windows gaped like hollow eyes. The fire that had claimed it 3 years ago had left little more than a shell. Hudson dismounted first, his boots crunching on the gravel. He reached up to help Martha down, his calloused hands steady and respectful. Watch your step, ma'am. There's bound to be nails and such. They picked their way through the rubble. Martha's skirts caught on charred timber, and memories flooded back. Summer socials on the wide porch. Christmas gatherings when Gerald Vane still had his fortune and his pride. Before the gambling, before the fire, before everything changed. Creek still running strong, Hudson noted, leading her around the ruins to where clear water splashed over rocks. The sound of it brought fresh hope to Martha's heart. The meadow beyond stretched green and promising, dotted with early wildflowers. The land remembers what it was, Martha said softly, even if people forget. Hudson nodded, squinting at the distant fence line where posts leaned drunkenly. Good water, good grass. Shame to let it all go to waste. He turned to face her, his expression earnest beneath his weathered hat. Got a proposition for you, Mrs. Lyle. Martha's hands twisted in her shawl. Oh? 2 names on the deed might just save it, he said slowly, choosing his words with care. Your husband's claim gives you rights here, same as mine. Together we could rebuild. Make it something worthwhile again. Martha stared at the ruins, her mind whirling. That would take considerable work, Mr. Boone, and considerable talk in town. Reckon so, he agreed, but I've never much cared what folks say. Question is, do you think it's worth doing? Martha closed her eyes, feeling the spring breeze on her face. A partnership with Hudson Boone. The very thought would have seemed absurd a week ago. But now, standing beside the creek that still sang its ancient song, she felt a stirring of purpose she hadn't known in years. Might we pray about it first? She asked hesitantly. Hudson removed his hat. Been a spell since I prayed with anyone, but I reckon that's fitting. They stood together by the creek, heads bowed. Martha's quiet words mingled with the water's music. Lord, guide our steps in this. Show us if this path is yours. When she opened her eyes, the morning light seemed brighter somehow. Yes, she said firmly. Yes, Mr. Boone. I think it is worth doing." His face creased in a rare smile. "Hudson, ma'am. If we're to be partners, might as well use my Christian name." "Martha, then," she replied, and they shook hands formally, the creek witness to their agreement. They spent the rest of the morning clearing rubble, working side by side in comfortable silence. Hudson's strength made quick work of the heavier beams, while Martha sorted through smaller debris, salvaging what could be saved. By noon, they had cleared a significant portion of the house site. "Foundation's still solid," Hudson observed, wiping sweat from his brow. "That's something to build on." After a simple lunch of bread and cheese, they turned their attention to the fences. Martha held posts steady, while Hudson drove them deep with powerful swings of the maul. The rhythm of their work felt natural, as if they'd done this together for years instead of hours. The sun was sinking toward the mountains when Hudson finally called a halt. "That's enough for one day," he said, pouring coffee from his battered tin pot into a single cup. "Best save something for tomorrow." Martha accepted the offered cup gratefully, taking a sip before passing it back. The coffee was strong and sweet, just as she liked it. They sat on a fallen log, watching the sunset paint the meadow in shades of rose and gold. "Thomas would have liked this," Martha said suddenly, surprising herself. "Seeing the place coming back to life." Hudson nodded slowly. "He was a good man, your Thomas. Tried to help folks, even when they didn't deserve it." "Yes," Martha smiled at the memory. "He always said everyone deserves a second chance." The peaceful moment shattered at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Luna Vane rode past on her glossy bay mare, her face set in lines of fury as she glared at them. She didn't speak, but her contempt was clear in every line of her rigid posture as she disappeared around the bend. Martha's hands trembled slightly as she stood. "Perhaps we should head back before it gets dark." The ride home was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. At Martha's cabin, Hudson helped her dismount, his touch as proper as ever. "I'll be by at first light tomorrow if that suits." "Yes," Martha nodded. "I'll have breakfast waiting." Inside her cabin, Martha lit the lamp and reached for Thomas's old Bible. The leather was smooth from years of handling, the pages marked with his neat notes. She sat in her rocking chair, letting the familiar words wash over her. Her eyes fell on a passage Thomas had underlined. "Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor." The words seemed to speak directly to her heart, both comfort and challenge. Was this unexpected partnership divine guidance or dangerous folly? Luna's hostile glare suggested there would be opposition, perhaps even trouble ahead. Yet something about working beside Hudson today had felt right, like finding a missing piece of a puzzle she hadn't known was incomplete. As the night deepened toward dawn, Martha came to a decision. She would help Hudson restore the ranch, not just for herself or for him, but to honor Thomas's memory. Her husband had tried to save the place once through an act of kindness. Perhaps now she could finish what he'd started. She closed the Bible gently, certain of her course. Outside her window, the stars began to fade as the first hint of morning touched the eastern sky. A new day was coming, bringing with it the promise of purpose and the challenge of change. Martha was ready to meet it. The mountain spring unfurled day by day, painting the meadows with wildflowers as Martha and Hudson settled into their shared labor. Each morning, Hudson's tall figure would appear at first light, removing his hat as Martha handed him a steaming cup of coffee on her porch. Their words were few, but the silence between them grew comfortable, like a well-worn quilt. At the ranch site, Hudson's axe rang steady against fresh-cut pine, the sound echoing across the valley. Martha watched him work, marveling at how his weathered hands could be both powerful enough to fell trees and gentle enough to show her exactly where to drive nails into new shingles. The roof needed extensive repair, and though her fingers ached by day's end, she felt satisfaction in every secured board. "Careful up there, ma'am," Hudson would call, his eyes tracking her movements as she navigated the slanted surface. His concern, though unnecessary, she'd helped Thomas with, plenty of repairs over the years, warmed her heart. Their days fell into a pleasant rhythm. While Hudson hauled stone for the foundation repairs, Martha tended to the cooking fire, stirring thick stews that filled the air with savory promises. She'd learned his favorites: beans with salt pork, cornbread golden brown on top, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. He never failed to thank her, hat in hand, as if each meal were a special gift. "Much obliged," he'd say, scraping his bowl clean. "Ain't had cooking like this since, well, been a mighty long time." The first Sunday after they began working together, Martha sat in her usual pew at the little white church, smoothing her best dress nervously. When Hudson appeared in the doorway, several heads turned. He took a seat near the back, but his presence filled the small space. Reverend Dobbs's sermon seemed to take on extra meaning that day, speaking of community and rebuilding broken places. The second Sunday, whispers followed them both. "The Boones," someone murmured as Martha passed. She felt her cheeks warm, but kept her eyes forward, finding strength in Hudson's steady presence a few pews behind. By the third week, the name had stuck. "Mornin', Mrs. Boone," called the miller's wife, her tone friendly but curious. Hudson, loading supplies at the general store, just tipped his hat with a slight smile, neither confirming nor denying the assumption. "Don't let it trouble you," he told Martha later, as they shared lunch in the shade of a half-built wall. "Folks will talk. It's about all there is to do in Cold River some days." Martha nodded, but her heart fluttered at how easily people had paired them in their minds. She couldn't deny that something was changing between them, as subtle as spring creeping into the mountains. Luna Vane, however, watched their progress with growing bitterness. Her sharp voice carried across the street one morning as Martha selected vegetables from the market stall. "It ain't natural, a widow her age catching a man like that. Must be some kind of charm or witchery." Martha's hands trembled on the tomatoes she was examining. The old shame tried to rise up, but before it could take hold, she remembered Hudson's quiet strength, his unfailing respect. She straightened her spine and made her purchases with dignity, Luna's words falling away like dead leaves in the wind. The turning point came when Reverend Dobbs rode out to the ranch site one warm afternoon. Martha had just finished patching the last section of roof, while Hudson was setting posts for the new porch. The preacher dismounted slowly, taking in their progress with evident pleasure. "The Lord's hand is surely in this work," he declared, walking the property's perimeter. "See how the wildflowers have returned? Even the land itself rejoices in restoration." Martha felt tears prick her eyes at his words. The Reverend had known her since Thomas's passing, had witnessed her lonely struggles. Now he stood in the shadow of rebuilt walls, offering blessing on this unexpected partnership. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and rose, Martha and Hudson sat down to their usual shared supper. The stew was simple, rabbit with early spring vegetables, but the bread was fresh-baked, and gratitude made every bite taste sweeter. Without thinking, Martha began to hum as she served the food. The tune was an old hymn, one her mother had sung while working. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." She almost stopped when she realized what she was doing, but then a deeper voice joined in. Hudson's singing was rough, unpracticed, trembling slightly on the higher notes. yet there was such sincerity in it that Martha's voice grew stronger, harmonizing with his as naturally as sunshine mixing with shadow. That saved a wretch like me. Their voices twined together in the gathering dusk, carrying across the meadow where new grass pushed through old ashes. The hymn spoke of being lost and found, of grace and hope and second chances. As the last note faded, Martha looked at Hudson and saw something new in his weather-lined face, a softness, a vulnerability she'd never noticed before. "My mother used to sing that," he said quietly, studying his empty bowl. "Been years since I joined in with anyone." "Mine too," Martha replied, understanding in her bones what it meant for him to share that piece of himself. She said singing makes the work lighter. Hudson nodded, and though he didn't speak again, the silence between them had shifted. It held all the things they weren't ready to say, all the possibility of what might grow from this careful friendship they were building. The next morning, they returned to their tasks with renewed energy. Martha noticed Hudson humming under his breath as he worked, and she smiled, knowing that something precious and fragile had taken root between them. Like the wildflowers pushing through the meadow's scarred earth, it would bloom in its own time. Each plank they nailed, each stone they set, each meal they shared was another thread in the tapestry of their days. The ranch was coming back to life under their joint care, but something else was being rebuilt too. Something neither of them had dared to hope for in their solitary lives. The sun set on another day of progress, painting the new roof beams in shades of gold. Martha and Hudson stood back to survey their work, their shadows stretching long across the ground they'd cleared together. In the distance, a meadowlark called its evening song, clear and sweet as hope. The May evening settled soft and golden over the rebuilt ranch. Martha stood in the new kitchen, surveying the preparations for the neighborhood supper. Steam rose from 3 large pots of venison stew, each seasoned with herbs from her garden. Fresh-baked bread cooled on the windowsill, its yeasty aroma mixing with the rich scent of coffee brewing on the wood stove. Through the window, she watched Hudson directing the carpenter boys as they set up borrowed tables in the yard. They'd come through last week with a wagon of spare lumber, refusing payment except for the promise of a good meal. Others had helped too, the blacksmith with nails, the cooper with water barrels, even the mercantile owner with window glass at half price. "Land sakes, Martha, you've outdone yourself," Sarah Miller exclaimed, entering with a cherry pie. More women followed, bearing covered dishes and curious expressions. They hadn't visited much since Thomas passed, but tonight their smiles seemed genuine. "The place looks right fine," Betty Thompson said, setting down a basket of cornbread. "Hudson's got a real talent for building." Martha nodded, touching the smooth-planed counter. "He does at that. Everything's solid as can be." Outside, lanterns began to glow as dusk approached. Someone had strung them along the new porch rails, their light catching the fresh whitewash. Jim Peterson unpacked his fiddle, and soon a lively tune drifted through the open windows. Hudson appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "Folks are gathering, Miss Martha. Reckon we ought to welcome them proper?" She smoothed her best dress, dark blue calico with tiny white flowers, and took his offered arm. Together they stepped onto the porch, where nearly 30 neighbors had assembled. Children darted between adults' legs, dogs lounged hopefully near the food tables, and conversation hummed like bees in clover. Reverend Dobbs raised his hands for silence. "Before we feast, let us thank the Lord for this fine gathering and the restoration of this homestead. We've watched it rise from ashes through the dedication of our brother Hudson and sister Martha. Their partnership shows us what can be achieved when we join in purpose and faith." "Amen," the crowd responded. Martha felt Hudson's arm tense slightly beneath her hand. The meal passed in a blur of conversation and laughter. Martha found herself surrounded by women who'd kept their distance for years, now eager to share recipes and garden advice. Hudson worked the crowd in his quiet way, thanking each person who'd contributed to the rebuilding. From the edge of the lantern light, Luna Vane watched. Her face was set in hard lines, hands clutching her shawl, though the evening was mild. When their eyes met briefly, Martha saw raw envy there, and something that might have been regret. As twilight deepened into true night, the fiddle music grew sweeter. Couples began to dance on the packed earth of the yard, their shadows stretching and shrinking in the lantern light. Martha sat contentedly on the porch steps, tapping her foot to the rhythm. Hudson appeared beside her, something clutched in his weathered hand. "Miss Martha," he said softly, "might we speak private-like for a moment?" Her heart quickened as she followed him to the quiet end of the porch. The stars were just beginning to show, bright as new dimes against the darkening sky. "I ain't much for fancy words," Hudson began, his voice low and serious. "But these past weeks working alongside you, well, they've meant something. Something important." Martha's hands trembled slightly as he continued. "I know I ain't got much to offer. No fine house or fancy clothes. But I got 2 strong hands and a heart that's learning to trust again." He opened his palm, revealing a ring carved from pine wood, polished smooth as glass. Intricate leaves were carved around its circumference, each detail perfect despite the humble material. "It's temporary," he added quickly, "just until I can afford proper gold. But I wanted you to have something I made myself, to show my intentions are honest." Tears blurred Martha's vision as Hudson knelt before her, just as he had that day in the store, but this time with such different meaning. The gathered neighbors fell silent, watching. "Martha Lyle," Hudson said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "would you consider making this partnership permanent? Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" For a moment, Martha couldn't speak. She saw their whole journey in her mind, from that first act of kindness, through weeks of shared work and quiet conversations, to this moment under the stars. She thought of Thomas, of his generous heart that had helped secure this very land. Somehow she felt his blessing in the soft spring air. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Hudson Boone, I will." A cheer went up from the crowd as Hudson slipped the wooden ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, smooth and warm against her skin. Martha's cheeks glowed with joy, and something deeper, a certainty that this was right and good and blessed. The fiddler struck up a waltz. Hudson held out his hand, and Martha stepped into his arms. They moved slowly, neither being much for dancing, but the moment felt perfect anyway. Other couples joined them, and soon the yard was full of spinning shadows and laughter. "Thank you, Lord," Hudson murmured as they danced, "for second chances and new beginnings." Martha squeezed his hand in agreement, too full of emotion for words. Around them, their neighbors clapped and smiled, children ran with sparklers borrowed from someone's 4th of July stores, and even the dogs seemed to bark in celebration. Only Luna remained apart, standing rigid at the property's edge. The lantern light caught tears on her cheeks before she turned and walked into the darkness, leaving behind both the celebration and perhaps some of her bitterness. As the evening drew to a close, Reverend Dobbs called everyone together for a final prayer. They stood in a circle, hands joined, while he asked God's blessing on the engaged couple and the restored ranch. Martha felt Hudson's strong fingers entwined with hers, the wooden ring a promise between them. The neighbors departed gradually, leaving behind empty dishes and full hearts. Soon, only the cricket's song filled the night air, accompanied by the soft creak of the porch swing where Martha and Hudson sat, comfortable in their shared silence. Martha touched the ring gently, admiring how the carved leaves caught the last lantern's light. "It's beautiful," she said. "I wouldn't trade it for all the gold in Laramie." Hudson's smile was soft in the darkness. "I reckon we found something worth more than gold anyway. Belonging, a real home." Martha leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the truth of his words settle deep in her soul. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient dance, blessing the end of loneliness and the beginning of something new. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the newly rebuilt ranch as Martha pinned sheets to the clothesline. The fresh cotton snapped in the breeze, bright white against the deepening blue sky. She hummed softly, pausing now and then to watch Hudson split kindling near the woodpile. His steady rhythm matched her own peaceful routine, until the distant sound of hoofbeats broke their quiet harmony. A rider appeared on the dusty road, his horse kicking up clouds that caught the sunlight. Martha shaded her eyes, noting the stranger's city clothes and official bearing. Even his mount looked Eastern-bred, too delicate for mountain work. Hudson set down his axe and moved to stand near Martha, his presence solid and reassuring. The rider dismounted with the awkward grace of someone more comfortable at a desk than in a saddle. "Afternoon, folks," he said, removing his hat to reveal hair untouched by sun or weather. "Name's Ellis Pratt, government surveyor." He pulled a leather document case from his saddlebag. "Mind if we talk inside? Got some matters that need discussing." Martha glanced at Hudson, who nodded slightly. "I'll put coffee on," she said, leading the way into their cabin. The interior still smelled of fresh-cut pine and morning's biscuits. Martha busied herself at the stove, while Hudson and Pratt settled at the table. She couldn't help but notice how the surveyor's citified boots hadn't collected much trail dust. He hadn't ridden far, likely coming from the railroad camp down in the valley. "Fine piece of land you've got here," Pratt began, spreading papers across the scrubbed wooden surface. "Real fine. That's partly why I'm here." Martha set 3 cups of coffee on the table, the china clinking softly. She'd used her best set, the one with tiny blue flowers around the rim. Some instinct told her they needed to show their dignity today. "These are federal documents," Pratt continued, tapping one paper with a clean fingernail. "Preliminary surveys indicate significant mineral deposits in this region, silver mainly. The railroad company's particularly interested in this section." His finger traced their property lines with uncomfortable familiarity. Hudson's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "This is our home," he said quietly but firmly. "Not a claim." Now, Pratt's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Nobody's making claims yet. We're just conducting official surveys. Federal law gives us certain rights when it comes to mineral exploration." Martha sat beside Hudson, their shoulders barely touching. The contact steadied her as Pratt continued explaining about easements and access rights and compensation formulas. His words blurred together, but their meaning was clear enough. Their peace was under threat. "What about our improvements?" Hudson asked. "We've put everything into rebuilding." Pratt shrugged, gathering his papers. "All improvements would be factored into any potential settlement, of course. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'll be back with formal notices once the preliminary work is done." He stood, straightening his vest. "Much obliged for the coffee, ma'am." They watched from the porch as he rode away, his horse picking a careful path down the rutted road. The fresh-washed sheets still fluttered on the line, suddenly seeming fragile as clouds. "I'm riding into town," Hudson said after a long moment. "Need to check if anyone else has heard about this." Martha nodded, understanding his need to act. "I'll keep supper warm." She watched him saddle his horse and ride out, his broad shoulders set with determination. The afternoon light had turned heavy, and dark clouds were building over the mountains. Martha gathered her laundry quickly, each piece a small comfort to fold and stack. Inside, she tried to keep busy, but her hands kept straying to the wooden ring on her finger. Finally, she knelt beside her bed and pulled out Thomas's old Bible. Its familiar weight in her lap brought some peace as she began to pray. "Lord," she whispered, "we need your guidance now. Show us the path through this valley." A knock at the door startled her from her prayers. Luna Vane stood on the porch, her face arranged in an expression of careful concern that didn't match the gleam in her eyes. "Oh, Martha," Luna said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I just heard the most terrible news. The surveyor's been all over town, talking about mineral rights and railroad claims." She settled uninvited into Martha's rocking chair. "I felt I simply had to come warn you." Martha's spine stiffened at Luna's false sympathy. "That's neighborly of you." "It's just tragic," Luna continued, barely concealing her satisfaction. "After all your work fixing up the old place, though I suppose you knew it was too good to last, you and Hudson playing at marriage, trying to hold on to land that's worth more than both of you combined." "We're not playing at anything," Martha said quietly, but Luna wasn't finished. "You'll lose everything, you know." The sneer in her voice was clear now. "The railroad always wins. Maybe if you'd been content with your little widow's cabin instead of reaching above yourself. I think you should leave." Martha's voice was steady, despite her trembling hands. Luna rose, smoothing her skirts. "I just thought you should be prepared. It's not like you have any real claim here, not like my family did. And now," she paused at the door, twisting the knife, "now you'll lose it all. Again." The door clicked shut behind her. Martha stood very still, fighting tears, until she heard Luna's buggy drive away. Then she moved to her writing desk and took out paper and pen. "Dear Reverend Dobbs," she wrote, her handwriting shaky at first but growing stronger. "I write to ask your counsel in a matter that threatens not just our home, but perhaps our very faith." She wrote steadily, explaining about the surveyor and Luna's visit, asking for wisdom and prayer. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance as storm clouds gathered over the mountains. The wind changed direction, carrying the scent of rain. Martha sealed the letter just as the first heavy drops began to fall. She moved to the window, watching the storm roll in across the valley. Somewhere out there, Hudson was riding home through the gathering darkness. She lit a lamp and set it in the window to guide him, then returned to her prayers. The cabin creaked in the rising wind, but Martha found comfort in its solid walls. Hudson had built them true and strong. Whatever came next, they would face it together, with faith as their foundation and love as their shelter. Thunder crashed closer now, and Martha added more wood to the stove. The soup she'd made earlier bubbled gently, filling the cabin with the scent of home. She touched the wooden ring again, drawing strength from its smooth surface and all it represented. "Lord," she prayed softly, "give us wisdom for tomorrow, and bring Hudson home safe through this storm." The rain fell harder, drumming on the roof like hundreds of urgent fingers. But inside, the lamp burned steady, casting its light out into the gathering dark, a beacon of hope against the coming storm. Thunder rumbled across Cold River Valley as Hudson's horse picked its way up the muddy path to the cabin. Martha stood at the window, wringing her hands in her apron. She'd been watching for him since noon, and now the afternoon light was fading fast beneath storm clouds that pressed low and heavy against the mountains. When Hudson dismounted, His shoulders were slumped in a way she'd never seen before. He removed his hat before stepping onto the porch, and Martha's heart sank at the defeat written across his weathered face. "It's true," he said simply as he stepped inside. Water dripped from his coat onto the plank floor. "Company filed papers this morning. They're claiming all the adjoining lands." Martha steadied herself against the table. "How long?" "1 week." Hudson's voice was rough with exhaustion. "We've got 7 days to show proof we own this land proper, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I'll make coffee," Martha said, because it was either keep her hands busy or give in to the trembling that threatened to overtake her. As she worked at the stove, Hudson shed his wet coat and settled heavily into a chair. "Talked to every clerk in town," he continued. "Railroad companies got papers going back 20 years. They're saying the mineral rights supersede any homestead claims." The coffee pot rattled against the stovetop as Martha's hands shook. "But Thomas's signature on the deed won't be enough on its own." Hudson rubbed his face. "Need more proof. Something that shows clear ownership, not just security interest." Martha poured 2 cups of coffee, adding an extra spoonful of sugar to Hudson's. He looked like he needed it. "Then we'll search," she said firmly. "Every paper, every document. There has to be something." Thunder crashed closer now, and rain began to hammer against the roof. Martha lit the kerosene lantern and set it on the table. Its warm glow pushed back the gathering darkness as they began their search. They started with Thomas's old trunk. Martha's fingers trembled as she lifted out her late husband's possessions one by one. Shirts she'd mended, letters from back east, a pocket watch that hadn't ticked in years. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, lay his Bible. Meanwhile, Hudson emptied his saddlebags onto the table. Trail maps spilled out alongside carefully folded documents, their corners soft from years of handling. Martha noticed how he arranged them with careful precision, but didn't reach for them to read. Hours passed. The storm raged outside while they worked in quiet desperation, the only sounds the rustle of paper and occasional rumble of thunder. Martha's eyes grew tired from squinting at faded ink in the lantern light. Finally, Hudson cleared his throat. "Martha," he said, his voice unusually hesitant. "I need to tell you something." She looked up from a stack of letters. Hudson's face was tight with shame. "I can't." He swallowed hard. "Can't make out most of these proper? Never learned my letters right?" Martha set down the papers she was holding. "Oh, Hudson." "Can read trail signs better than any man alive," he continued roughly. "But when it comes to writing," he gestured at the documents spread before them. "Been managing by memorizing shapes of important words. But this needs real reading." Martha reached across the table and took his calloused hand in hers. "Then we'll do it together," she said simply. "You've got other gifts. The Lord made sure between the two of us, we have what we need." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the gratitude in Hudson's eyes. They moved their chairs closer together, and Martha began reading documents aloud while Hudson listened intently, occasionally stopping her to point out official seals or signatures he recognized. Near midnight, as Martha's voice grew hoarse, Hudson suddenly straightened. "Wait," he said. "That Bible of Thomas's, you said he marked passages?" Martha nodded, reaching for the worn volume. He'd make little crosses next to verses that spoke to him particularly. They opened the Bible together, their hands brushing as they turned the delicate pages. In the Psalms, they found what they were looking for: Thomas's distinct mark beside the 37th Psalm. "The meek shall inherit the earth." But it wasn't just the cross mark that caught their attention. In the margin, in Thomas's careful hand, was a notation. Claim witnessed by Judge Harrison, April 12, 1863. Let it stand as testimony. Hudson's breath caught. "Martha," he whispered. "Could this be the proof we need?" Her voice shook with hope. Thomas was always careful about legal matters. He wouldn't have written it without reason. Maybe the Lord left us our proof after all. Hudson's rough whisper was barely audible over the storm. Lightning split the sky again, closer this time. The thunder that followed rattled the windows in their frames. Without discussing it, they both bowed their heads. "Lord," Martha began, her voice trembling but sure, "we thank you for this sign of hope." "And ask for strength," Hudson added quietly, "to face whatever comes." Their hands remained clasped over the open Bible as they prayed, while rain lashed the windows and wind howled in the chimney. Martha felt Hudson's fingers tighten around hers, and she squeezed back. In that moment, they were bound together by something stronger than fear, a shared faith that somehow they would find their way through this storm. The lantern flickered as another gust rattled the cabin. Martha reached to adjust the wick, and the light steadied, casting their shadows on the wall behind them. Two figures, heads bowed together over ancient words that might hold the key to their future. Outside, the storm showed no sign of letting up. But inside, despite their fear and uncertainty, a fragile hope had taken root. They had each other, they had their faith, and now they might have the proof they needed to save their home. Tomorrow they would take the Bible to town, see if Thomas's notation could carry legal weight. But for now, they simply sat together in the lantern light, drawing strength from each other's presence as the storm raged on. Thunder rolled again across the valley, but its power seemed somehow diminished now. They had found something stronger than their fears, a shared purpose, a shared faith, and perhaps, God willing, a way to keep their home. The morning dawned clear and crisp after the storm, puddles reflecting the pale blue sky like scattered mirrors. Martha's hands shook as she wrapped Thomas's Bible carefully in a clean piece of cotton. Hudson stood by his horse, checking the cinch one final time before their ride into Cold River. "Are you certain you want to do this alone?" Martha asked, handing him the wrapped Bible. Hudson tucked it securely in his saddlebag. "Reckon it's best. Judge might take it more serious-like coming from the land's co-owner." His voice was gentle but firm. "You rest up from our late night of searching." Martha nodded, though worry gnawed at her heart. She watched him mount up, his broad shoulders straight despite the weight of their hopes riding with him. As his horse splashed down the muddy trail, she pressed her hand to her chest, fighting an inexplicable sense of dread. The courthouse was unusually crowded when Hudson arrived. Word of the railroad's claim had spread fast, drawing curious onlookers and worried homesteaders whose own lands might be next. He removed his hat as he entered, conscious of the mud on his boots and the wildness of his appearance among the townspeople's Sunday best. Luna Vane sat in the front row, wearing a dress that would have better suited a woman half her age. Beside her was a sharp-featured man in an expensive suit, the railroad's lawyer, Hudson guessed. They whispered together, and Luna's laugh carried across the room like the cry of a magpie. Judge Harrison looked tired as he called the session to order. Hudson stepped forward when his name was called, Thomas's Bible clutched in his weathered hands. "Your Honor," he began, his deep voice rough with emotion, "I come bearing proof of rightful ownership." He unwrapped the Bible with careful reverence, marking the passage with trembling fingers. "Thomas Lyle himself recorded the claim here, witnessed by yourself, dated April 12, 1863. The railroad lawyer stood smoothly. "Objection, Your Honor. A personal notation in a family Bible hardly constitutes legal documentation." "If I may," Hudson persisted. "Thomas Lyle was known for his—" Luna's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. As if a mountain man who can barely write his own name could understand property law. Her lips curved in a cruel smile. Or perhaps the widow's been teaching him his letters between other activities. The courthouse erupted in shocked whispers. Hudson's face darkened like a thunderhead. Before anyone could move, his fist crashed down on the wooden table before him. "You'll not speak of Martha that way," his voice boomed off the courthouse walls. "That woman's got more honor in her little finger than you've shown in your whole life, Luna Vane." "Order!" Judge Harrison's gavel cracked like gunfire. "Mr. Boone, control yourself." But the damage was done. 2 deputies moved swiftly to Hudson's sides, taking his arms. The Bible fell to the floor with a dull thud that seemed to echo in Martha's heart, though she was miles away. "Contempt of court," the judge declared wearily. "1 night in jail to cool that temper, Mr. Boone." He raised his voice over Hudson's protests. "And we'll reconvene in 3 days' time to allow proper verification of this alleged proof of claim." As the deputies led Hudson away, Luna's satisfied smirk followed him. The railroad lawyer gathered his papers unhurriedly, knowing time was on their side. Word reached Martha within the hour, carried by Reverend Dobbs himself. She sat perfectly still as he explained what had happened, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "They can't keep him more than a night," the Reverend assured her. "And I've already sent word to Judge Harrison's clerk about verifying Thomas's notation." Martha nodded mechanically, but her mind was with Hudson, imagining him pacing the small jail cell like a caged mountain lion. When Reverend Dobbs left, promising to return tomorrow, the silence of the cabin pressed in around her like a physical weight. She tried to keep busy. There were chickens to feed, water to draw, 1,000 small tasks that usually filled her days. But everything reminded her of Hudson now. The axe he'd left learning against the woodpile, the chair where he sat for supper, the coffee cup he always used. As evening approached, she built up the hearth fire, more for comfort than warmth. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and memories of the previous night flooded back. Hudson's confession about his reading, the way their hands had touched over the Bible's pages, the shared prayer that had bound them together. Martha sank into her rocking chair, no longer able to hold back her tears. They came quietly at first, then in great, shuddering sobs that echoed in the empty cabin. She hadn't cried like this since Thomas died, hadn't allowed herself to feel so deeply vulnerable. "Lord," she whispered between sobs, "please keep him safe." Her hands twisted in her apron. "I never meant to need anyone again, never meant to care so much." But she did care, more than she'd been willing to admit, even to herself. Hudson wasn't just the strong hands that helped rebuild the ranch, or the quiet presence that kept Luna's cruelty at bay. Somewhere between his kneeling in the general store and last night's shared vigil, he'd become essential to her happiness in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. "I'm too old for such foolishness," she scolded herself, wiping her eyes. But her heart paid no attention to such practical concerns. It knew what it knew, that Hudson Boone's absence left a hollow space in her world that no amount of busy work could fill. The fire crackled and settled, sending up a shower of sparks. Martha watched them rise and fade, like the bright hopes of the morning turning to ash. 3 days suddenly seemed an eternity to wait. She rose and went to the window, gazing toward town where the first lamps were being lit. Somewhere in one of those buildings, Hudson was spending his first night behind bars, all because he'd defended her honor. The thought brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Please," she prayed again, resting her forehead against the cool glass. "Keep him strong. Keep him safe." She hesitated, then added in a whisper, "And bring him back to me." The stars were beginning to appear, the same stars she and Hudson had admired just nights ago from the porch. Martha stayed at the window long after dark, her heart reaching out through the night toward the man who'd become more precious to her than she'd ever imagined possible. In the quiet hours that followed, Martha finally admitted to herself what her heart had known for weeks. She loved Hudson Boone, not just as a friend or partner, but with the deep, abiding love she'd thought herself too old to feel again. The revelation both warmed and worried her. What if the railroad claim succeeded? What if they lost everything they'd worked for? What if, and this fear cut deepest, Hudson regretted choosing to stand beside an aging widow against the whole world? The fire burned low as Martha kept her lonely vigil, prayers mixing with tears until she could no longer tell them apart. Tomorrow she would be strong again, would face Luna's triumph and the town's whispers with dignity. But tonight, in the privacy of her grief, she let herself feel the full measure of her fear and longing. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the darkness, its lonely song echoing Martha's aching heart. She had never felt Hudson's absence more keenly than in these quiet hours, never more deeply understood how completely he'd become part of her world. All she could do now was pray and wait, holding on to faith that somehow God would see them through this trial. The night stretched long before her, each hour marked by the slow ticking of the mantel clock and the steady beating of her worried heart. Dawn painted Cold River's streets in shades of gray as Martha pulled her woolen shawl tighter against the biting spring wind. Her boots clicked softly on the wooden sidewalk, each step carrying her closer to the jailhouse where Hudson waited. The morning air held a sharp chill that matched the anxiety in her heart. Shop owners swept their porches, pretending not to watch as she passed. A few nodded respectfully, but most averted their eyes. News of yesterday's courthouse drama had spread through town like wildfire. Martha held her head high, though her hands trembled beneath her shawl. The jailhouse stood at the end of Main Street, a squat building of weathered boards and iron bars. Sheriff Crane met her at the door, his weathered face softening with sympathy. "Morning, Ms. Lyle," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "He's been asking after you." Martha's throat tightened. "How is he, Sheriff?" "Quiet as a church mouse all night." The sheriff unlocked the heavy door. "Which is saying something, considering the state he was in yesterday." Inside, the air smelled of coffee and wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove. Martha followed Sheriff Crane past his desk to the cells at the back. Hudson sat on a narrow cot, his broad shoulders hunched forward, hands clasped between his knees. A purple bruise darkened his jaw where he'd caught an elbow during the scuffle. "Hudson," Martha whispered, moving to the bars. He looked up, his eyes brightening despite the shadows beneath them. "Martha." He stood slowly, favoring his right side. "You shouldn't have come all this way." "Of course I should have." She reached through the bars, and he took her hand in both of his. His skin felt rough and warm against hers. "Are you hurt badly?" "Just my pride," he said with a ghost of a smile. "And maybe a rib or two." Sheriff Crane cleared his throat. "I'll give you folks a few minutes." His boots echoed on the wooden floor as he walked to the front office, pulling the door closed behind him. Martha studied Hudson's face through the bars. Despite his attempt at lightness, she saw deep worry in the lines around his eyes. "What happened yesterday?" she asked softly. "Really?" Hudson's shoulders slumped. He released her hand and paced the small cell like a caged bear. "I lost my temper. Plain and simple. Should have known better." He stopped, staring at the wall. But when Luna started in about you—" His hands clenched into fists. "You were defending my honor," Martha said. "Again. Fat lot of good it did." He turned to face her, his expression haunted. "Martha, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said weeks ago." She waited, her heart beating faster at the pain in his voice. "I knew your Thomas," he said finally. "Rode with him years back before you two were married. We were guides for the same outfit." Martha's hand flew to her throat. "You knew Thomas?" Hudson nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "The winter of '58. We were leading a party through Shield Pass when the blizzard hit. Thomas—" His voice broke. "He went back for a lost child. I tried to follow, but the snow—" He pressed his forehead against the bars. "I failed him, Martha. Failed you both." Martha's legs weakened. She gripped the cell bars to steady herself as memories crashed over her, waiting through that terrible storm, praying for Thomas's return, the knock on her door that changed everything. "The search party found him 2 days later," Hudson continued, his voice thick with old grief. "Wrapped in his coat was the child, alive. But Thomas—" He shook his head. "I should have been faster. Should have reached him in time." "Oh, Hudson." Tears spilled down Martha's cheeks as understanding dawned. "Is that why you've lived alone all these years? Carrying that guilt?" He nodded, still not looking at her. Martha reached through the bars again, touching his arm. "Listen to me, Hudson Boone. You didn't fail anyone." "Martha, no." Her voice grew stronger. "Thomas died as he lived, helping others, and that child survived because of both of you." She squeezed his arm until he finally met her gaze. "You didn't fail him. You carried the mercy he prayed for." Hudson stared at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "How can you say that?" "Because I knew my husband's heart." Martha smiled through her tears. "He would have been proud to call you friend, Hudson, as am I." A shudder ran through his big frame. Slowly he covered her hand with his own. They stood in silence, connected through the iron bars, as morning light streamed through the high window. Finally, Martha straightened her shoulders. "Now then, we have work to do." "Work?" "I'm going to fight for both. Our names," she said firmly. "That ranch belongs to us, fair and square, and I won't let anyone take it. Not Luna, not the railroad, not anyone." A hint of Hudson's usual strength returned to his voice. "You shouldn't have to fight alone." "I'm not alone." She squeezed his hand. "I have faith, I have right on my side, and I have you, even if there are bars between us for now." Sheriff Crane's boots announced his return. "Time's about up, folks." Martha nodded. "I'll be back tomorrow with clean clothes and some proper food." She met Hudson's gaze. "Hold fast to hope." "Yes, ma'am." Something like peace settled over his features. "I reckon I will." Martha gathered her shawl and turned to leave. At the door, Sheriff Crane touched her elbow. "He's a good man, ma'am," the sheriff said quietly. "Might have lost his temper, but his heart's in the right place." "Yes," Martha agreed. "I know it is." The wind had died down as she walked home, but Martha barely noticed. Her mind was already planning what needed to be done. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table, a single candle burning beside her. Thomas's Bible lay open to Psalm 37, and fresh paper waited for her pen. Her hand moved steadily across the page as she wrote her affidavit, recording every detail of Thomas's original claim and Hudson's connection to it. When she finished, she carefully marked the verse again in the Bible, drawing a line beneath the words that had given them hope. "The meek shall inherit the earth," she whispered, touching the faded inscription beside it in Thomas's hand. Tomorrow she would face the court alone if she must, but tonight she had work to do. The candle burned low as Martha wrote on, her determination growing stronger with each word. Outside, an owl called into the darkness. Martha paused, her pen hovering above the paper. Somewhere in town, Hudson waited in his cell, no longer carrying his burden alone. She smiled softly and returned to her writing, faith and purpose guiding her hand through the night. The morning dawned clear and cold over Cold River as Martha stood before her mirror, pinning her silver hair neat and tight. Her fingers trembled slightly as she fastened her best brooch, Thomas's last Christmas gift, to her collar. The weight of her husband's Bible pressed against her heart, where she'd tucked it into her coat pocket. Outside, hoofbeats approached. Reverend Dobbs sat astride his dappled mare, his clerical collar stark white against his black coat. "Ready, Martha?" he asked softly. She nodded, gathering her skirts to mount the buggy he'd brought. "As ready as the Lord can make me." They rode in silence through town, past shuttered shops and curious faces peering from windows. The courthouse loomed ahead, its weathered columns casting long shadows across the street. Already, a crowd had gathered on the steps, their whispers carrying on the morning breeze. Martha's heart quickened as she saw Luna Vane standing near the entrance, wearing a fine green dress that caught the sunlight. Luna's painted lips curved into a superior smile as she leaned close to a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit. The railroad's lawyer, Martha guessed. Inside, the courthouse smelled of pine soap and leather-bound books. Martha took her seat in the front row, conscious of every creak of the wooden bench. Hudson's empty chair beside her felt like an accusation. Through the barred window, she could see the jailhouse where he waited. The judge entered, and everyone rose. Judge Harrison was a lean man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen 40 years of frontier justice. He adjusted his spectacles and called the session to order. "Matter of territorial claim dispute," he announced. "Railroad interests versus Lyle Boone Partnership." He peered over his glasses. "I understand we have new evidence to present?" The railroad lawyer stood, straightening his silk vest. "Indeed, Your Honor. Marcus Greenfield, representing Western Pacific Railroad." He lifted a sheaf of papers. "We contend that the original deed bearing Thomas Lyle's mark is invalid, as it was not properly witnessed or recorded according to territorial statute." Luna's smile widened as scattered murmurs filled the room. Martha felt her throat tighten, but kept her spine straight as her mother had taught her. Greenfield continued, his voice smooth as creek stones. "A simple X mark, Your Honor, without proper documentation cannot be considered binding, especially given the substantial interests at stake." "That mark stands for a man's word before God," Martha said suddenly, rising to her feet. Her voice carried clear and steady across the hushed room. "And that's law enough in this valley." Judge Harrison leaned forward. "Mrs. Lyle, you have evidence to support this claim?" "I do, Your Honor." Martha withdrew Thomas's Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by years of faithful hands. Her fingers found the ribbon marker, and she opened it to Psalm 37. "My husband's mark appears here," she said, stepping forward to place the Bible before the judge. "Made 20 years ago, the same day he signed the deed. He couldn't write his name, but he could read God's word, and he marked this verse as witness to his promise." The judge studied the page carefully. "Reverend Dobbs," he called, "step forward." The minister rose, his boots echoing on the floorboards. "Yes, Your Honor." "You've served this community how long?" 23 years this coming spring." "Did you know Thomas Lyle?" "I did." Reverend Dobbs nodded solemnly. "I was there the day he made that mark, both in this Bible and on the deed in question. He chose that particular verse, "The meek shall inherit the earth," saying it reminded him that God's law stands above man's greed. Luna shifted in her seat, her smile faltering. The railroad lawyer cleared his throat. "Your Honor, surely a religious text cannot serve as legal documentation." "Mr. Greenfield," Judge Harrison interrupted. "Are you familiar with Territorial Statute 47 regarding witness validation of contracts?" That is..." The lawyer fumbled with his papers. "I am," the judge continued. "It specifically allows for religious texts to serve as supporting documentation of intent and identity, particularly in cases involving marks rather than signatures." He looked up, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. This territory was built by men and women who may not have wielded fancy pens, but whose word and mark were their bond before God and neighbor alike. Martha's hands clasped tightly as the judge examined the Bible again. "Furthermore," he continued, "Reverend Dobbs's witness testimony establishes clear providence. The mark is consistent, the date aligns, and the intention is documented." He set the Bible down firmly. "I find the claim lawful and binding under territorial statute." A collective gasp swept through the room. Luna's face drained of color as she gripped the railing in front of her. The railroad lawyer's mouth opened and closed without sound. "The Lyle-Boone partnership claim stands," Judge Harrison declared, bringing down his gavel. "This hearing is concluded." The crack of wood on wood was nearly lost in the sudden eruption of applause. Martha swayed slightly, relief flooding through her limbs. Reverend Dobbs steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "The Lord's justice prevails," he murmured. Townspeople surged forward, surrounding Martha with congratulations and backslaps. Through their midst, she saw Luna flee the courthouse, her green skirts swishing angrily through the door. The railroad lawyer followed, stuffing papers into his leather satchel. "Mrs. Lyle," Judge Harrison called over the commotion. He held out Thomas's Bible. "I believe this belongs to you." Martha took it carefully, cradling the precious book against her chest. "Thank you, Your Honor, for everything." He smiled slightly. "Thank your husband, ma'am. His mark may have been simple, but his wisdom served you well." The judge gathered his robes. "I'll have the release papers drawn up for Mr. Boone within the hour." Martha could barely keep her feet under her as she made her way outside. The morning had warmed, and sunshine sparkled off the frost-touched buildings. A crowd still milled about, discussing the verdict in excited tones. Reverend Dobbs helped her into the buggy. "Shall we fetch Hudson?" he asked with a knowing smile. Martha nodded, unable to speak past the joyful tightness in her throat. As they drove toward the jail, she opened the Bible once more to Thomas's marked verse. Her fingers traced the faded X that had preserved their home and future. "Thank you," she whispered, touching the page where her first husband's faith had protected her second chance at happiness. The Bible's familiar weight in her lap felt like a bridge between past and future, loss and hope, grief and grace. The morning breeze carried the sound of church, bells across Cold River Valley, ringing out like joyful confirmation that justice, faith, and courage had prevailed in one clear breath of mountain air. Evening shadows stretched across Cold River's main street as townsfolk gathered outside the jailhouse. Lantern light flickered against weathered walls, casting warm circles in the growing dusk. Martha Lyle stood near the courthouse steps, her late husband's Bible pressed close to her heart. The leather was smooth beneath her fingers, worn by years of faithful reading. Women whispered behind raised hands while men shifted from boot to boot, their Sunday hats clutched respectfully to their chests. Even the children, usually restless at this hour, stood quietly beside their parents. The air hummed with anticipation. Reverend Dobbs appeared at Martha's elbow, his kind face glowing in the lantern light. "Are you ready, sister?" he asked softly. Martha nodded, unable to find words. Her throat felt tight with emotion as she watched the jail door. The past few days had changed everything. The court victory, Hudson's confession about Thomas, and the deep stirring in her heart that she'd tried so long to deny. The crowd's murmuring ceased as keys rattled in the iron lock. The heavy door creaked open, and Hudson Boone emerged, blinking in the golden light. His face bore shadows of stubble, and his shirt was wrinkled from 3 nights behind bars. But his eyes were clear and steady as they found Martha's. For a moment, he stood frozen on the threshold. Then, with deliberate grace that belied his size, Hudson removed his battered hat and dropped it in the dust. The entire town held its breath as he crossed the street with measured steps. Martha's heart thundered against her ribs as Hudson approached. The Bible trembled slightly in her grasp. When he reached her, he did something that sparked gasps of recognition from those gathered. He knelt before her, just as he had that first morning in the general store when Luna's cruel laughter had echoed through the aisles. But this time, no mockery followed. No whispers sliced the air, only reverent silence surrounded them as Hudson looked up at Martha, his weather-worn face softened by lamplight and something deeper. Hope, perhaps, or love finally unbound from guilt. Martha's voice came quiet, but clear in the hush. "You asked that day if I had a husband." She paused, gathering courage as tears brightened her eyes. "I do now, if you'll have me still." A tear tracked down Hudson's cheek, catching the light like a star fallen to earth. His voice was rough with emotion as he answered, "By God's grace, I always have." The crowd erupted in cheers and calls of blessing. Women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs while men clapped each other's shoulders. Someone started singing an old hymn, and others joined in, their voices rising sweet and clear into the evening air. Reverend Dobbs stepped forward, raising his hand in blessing over the couple. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, his smile wide beneath his graying mustache. "What began as an act of chivalry has bloomed into true love, witnessed by God and this community." Hudson rose to his feet, taking Martha's free hand in his calloused one. His thumb brushed over the simple pine ring he'd carved for her weeks ago, when hope was just beginning to take root. At the edge of the crowd, a flash of green caught Martha's eye. Luna Vane stood half hidden in shadow, her face a mask of complex emotions. Bitterness, perhaps, or regret. For a moment, their eyes met across the lamplit street. Then Luna turned away, slipping into the gathering darkness like a ghost of pride laid finally to rest. The church bells began to ring, their joyful pealing rolling across the valley like waves of grace. Each clear note seemed to declare that love could bloom in the most unexpected seasons, that mercy could heal the deepest wounds, that faith could build bridges across the widest chasms of loss and time. Couples began to dance in the street as a fiddle struck up a tune. Children twirled with their arms outstretched, and old men tapped their canes in time with the music. The entire town had become a celebration of redemption, found and hope restored. Martha and Hudson stood in the midst of it all, their joined hands a simple testament to the power of forgiveness. The Bible she held contained not just Thomas's mark now, but the story of how his last act of kindness had opened the door for new love to enter. "Shall we dance, Mrs. Boone?" Hudson asked softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Martha's heart soared at the name. "I reckon we shall, Mr. Boone," she answered, allowing him to take the Bible and set it carefully aside. As they moved together to the music, Martha caught glimpses of their neighbors' faces in the lamplight. The general store owner who had witnessed that first morning, the deputy who had brought Hudson meals in jail, the school children who had helped clear rubble from the ranch. Each one had become part of their story, threads woven into this tapestry of community and grace. The fiddle played on as stars began to appear above the mountains. Lantern light danced across weathered storefronts and worn boardwalks, transforming the frontier town into something magical. For this one evening, Cold River felt less like a harsh territory outpost and more like a glimpse of heaven's own gathering. Hudson held Martha with gentle reverence as they swayed to the music. His voice was for her alone when he whispered, "I never thought I'd find home again after Thomas died in that storm. Spent years running from the guilt." "And I never thought I'd find love at my age," Martha replied softly. "Thought I'd just fade away in that cabin, listening to Luna's whispers about the foolish widow." "Reckon the Lord had other plans," Hudson said, his arm tightening protectively around her waist. "He surely did." Martha rested her head against his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart. "Thomas would be glad, you know. He always said God's mercy was bigger than our mistakes." The bells rang out once more, their bronze voices carrying across the valley where their ranch waited, ready for new life to fill its rebuilt walls. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges, but tonight was for celebrating love redeemed by faith and courage. As they danced beneath the rising moon, Martha and Hudson's shadows merged into one on the dusty street. No longer the lonely widow and the guilt-haunted mountain man, but partners bound by God's grace and their own choosing. Around them, the town that had witnessed their journey from mockery to marriage continued its joyful celebration, every voice and footstep declaring that love could begin again, even in life's winter season. The late summer sun warmed the newly shingled roof of the ranch house as hammers rang out across the yard. 6 weeks had passed since Martha and Hudson's wedding, and the old Vane property had transformed from ruins into something remarkable. Hudson wiped sweat from his brow, pausing in his work to watch Martha direct a group of women arranging furniture on the wide front porch. Her silver hair caught the light, and the simple gold band on her finger, replacing the pine ring he'd carved, glinted as she gestured. The sight still made his heart swell with gratitude. "Ma'am, where would you like these quilts?" called Sarah, a young widow from over near Laramie, her arms full of colorful blankets. "In the east bedroom, dear," Martha answered. "That's where you and little Tommy will be staying." The house had grown beyond their original plans, with 2 new wings added specifically to shelter those who needed a fresh start. Hudson had insisted on wide hallways and gentle ramps alongside the stairs, making it accessible for veterans who, like young Jim Cooper, came home from the war missing limbs or bearing other wounds. "Need a hand there, soldier?" Hudson called out, noticing Jim struggling with a heavy wooden beam. The young man's empty sleeve was pinned neatly at his side, but determination showed in his face. "Much obliged, Mr. Boone," Jim answered, his voice strained. Together they lifted the beam into place, Hudson matching his pace to Jim's ability. "You're getting stronger," Hudson observed quietly. "Reckon you'll be building your own place before long." Jim's answering smile held pride. "Yes, sir, though I hate to leave once it's done. This place, it's become more than just shelter." From the kitchen, the aroma of Martha's famous venison stew wafted across the yard, mixing with the scent of fresh-cut pine. She'd been cooking since dawn, preparing to feed the dozens of neighbors who'd turned out to help with the final touches on what folks had taken to calling Cold River Widows Ranch. Reverend Dobbs arrived just before noon, his saddlebags bulging with Bibles for the house's small library. He found Martha in the kitchen, stirring her enormous pot of stew. "Sister Martha," he greeted her warmly, "the Lord's blessing shines bright on this place." "That it does, Reverend," she agreed, wiping her hands on her apron, "though I never dreamed our little ranch would grow into this." The preacher's eyes crinkled kindly. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. Shall we gather everyone for the dedication?" At Martha's nod, the dinner bell rang out across the property. People began gathering in the front yard. Widows who'd found new purpose here, veterans learning to live again, neighbors who'd donated lumber and labor, and even some who'd once whispered cruel gossip, but now brought pies and preserves as peace offerings. Hudson took his place beside Martha as Reverend Dobbs opened his Bible to Psalm 37. The same passage that had saved their claim now seemed prophetic. "The meek shall inherit the earth." "This house," Dobbs proclaimed, his voice carrying across the yard, "stands as testament to God's promise. What began in mockery has become mercy. What started in loneliness has grown into family. Let all who enter here find rest for their souls and hope for tomorrow." "Amen," the crowd responded. Martha squeezed Hudson's hand as neighbors came forward with housewarming gifts. There were quilts sewn with intricate patterns, tools for the workshop, books for the library, and enough pies to feed an army. Each gift represented more than its practical value. It was the community's way of embracing the ranch's mission. As the afternoon waned, Hudson climbed a ladder with a freshly painted sign. The words, "Mercy built this house," took shape in careful strokes above the gate. Martha watched from below, remembering that first day in the general store when he'd knelt before her. Who could have known that one act of kindness would lead to all this? "Lord," she whispered, her heart full, "thank you for second chances." The setting sun painted the new sign in gold as everyone gathered for supper. Laughter and conversation filled the air as Martha ladled out stew and children played between the tables. Even the most skeptical townsfolk had to admit that the ranch had become something special. Not just a house rebuilt, but hope restored. Jim Cooper's voice rose above the happy chaos. "To Mr. and Mrs. Boone!" Others joined in the toast, raising cups of coffee and lemonade. "They didn't just rebuild a house, they rebuilt our faith in new beginnings." Autumn painted Cold River Valley in rich golds and deep crimsons as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Martha and Hudson Boone sat together on their wide front porch, the wood still fresh enough to carry the scent of pine. The evening air held just enough chill to make the woolen shawl around Martha's shoulders welcome. From the newly built bunkhouse, laughter floated across the yard, where several of their resident widows gathered around the hearth. Young Sarah's voice rose above the others, telling a story that brought more peals of mirth. Down by the creek, horses grazed peacefully in the meadow, their shapes dark against the golden grass. The church bells began their evening song, the sound carrying clearly across the valley. Each toll seemed to mark another blessing, another prayer answered in ways Martha never could have imagined just months ago. Hudson shifted in his chair, reaching into his vest pocket. His weathered hands, strong enough to build a house yet gentle enough to calm wild horses, withdrew a small leather pouch. "Been meaning to give you this," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "Took a full season, but I keep my promises." Martha's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the pouch. Inside lay a simple gold ring, catching the last rays of sunlight. Her vision blurred with tears as Hudson carefully took it and slipped it onto her finger, replacing the carved pine ring he'd given her that evening under the lanterns. "It's perfect," she whispered, touching the smooth metal with wonder. The church bells continued their song, filling the comfortable silence between them with their melody. Martha wiped her eyes with the corner of her shawl. You came when I'd given up hope, she said softly, remembering those lonely days when mockery had nearly broken her spirit. That morning in the store, I thought I'd never hold my head up again. Hudson's large hand enveloped hers, the gold ring warm between their palms. The Lord just sent me when you needed proof he still listens, he answered, his voice humble but certain. Been listening to both of us all along, I reckon. They sat together as the bells faded into evening silence, watching the mountains turn rose-pink with sunset. No whispers followed them now, no cruel laughter echoed in their memories. There was only peace, in their hearts, in their home, and in the knowledge that love could bloom fresh and true at any season of life. The horses nickered softly by the creek, and more laughter drifted from the bunkhouse. In the valley below, lights began to twinkle in Cold River's windows. Martha squeezed Hudson's hand, feeling the solid strength of his grip and the endless mercy of second chances. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.